In the year 1323 BCE, a young king died in Egypt. He was barely 19 years old. His name was Tutankhamun, but the world would forget him for over 3,000 years. His tomb, unlike those of greater pharaohs, was small, almost insignificant, and perhaps that's exactly what saved it. You see, the great pharaohs built monuments to themselves, massive pyramids, grand temples with their names carved in stone 50 feet high. But tomb robbers knew where to look. Within decades, sometimes even years of a pharaoh's burial, thieves would break in. They would steal the gold, the jewelry, the sacred oils. They would unwrap mummies looking for amulets hidden in the linen. The great pharaohs, despite all their power, couldn't protect their eternal rest. But Tutankhamun, he was different. He died young, unexpectedly. Some say from an infection after breaking his leg. Others whisper of malaria, or even murder. His tomb was prepared hastily. No grand pyramid, just a small chamber in the Valley of the Kings, hidden beneath the entrance to another tomb built centuries later. The desert sand drifted over it. Centuries passed, the new kingdom fell. The Persian Empire rose and fell. Alexander the Great conquered Egypt. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled. Cleopatra died. Rome absorbed Egypt into its empire. Christianity spread. Islam arrived. The Ottoman Turks came and went. Through all of this, through more than 3 millennia, Tutankhamun slept undisturbed in his golden coffin. Howard Carter had been searching for 20 years. Everyone told him to give up. The Valley of the Kings had been picked clean, they said. Every tomb discovered, every chamber explored. But Carter believed. He had one more season of funding from his patron, Lord Carnarvon. One more chance. November 4th, 1922. A water boy working at the excavation site stuck his tool in the sand and hit something solid. Stone steps. Carter was called immediately. His hands trembling, he cleared the sand. 1 step. 2 steps. 3. 12 steps leading down to a sealed doorway. On the seal, he could make out the name, Tutankhamun. When they finally broke through, after weeks of careful work, after clearing the entrance tunnel filled with ancient rubble, Carter held up a candle and peered through a small hole into the darkness beyond. Lord Carnarvon, waiting behind him, couldn't contain himself. "Can you see anything?" he asked. Carter's reply has echoed through history. "Yes, wonderful things." The tomb contained over 5,000 objects, golden chariots, beds shaped like sacred animals, chests filled with clothing, board games, walking sticks, food for the afterlife, wine jars with their vintage year still readable, and in the center of it all, a solid gold coffin containing the mummy of a boy king who died 3,000 years ago. But here's what haunts me about Tutankhamun's story. He wasn't a great pharaoh. He accomplished nothing remarkable in his short reign. He was a minor footnote in history, elevated to the throne only because the royal line had nearly died out. Yet he became the most famous pharaoh of all time, not for what he did in life, but for dying quietly and being forgotten so completely that even the tomb robbers forgot where he was buried. The great pharaohs, Ramesses II, who ruled for 66 years, Thutmose III, who built an empire, Hatshepsut, who defied tradition to rule as pharaoh, their tombs were all robbed in ancient times, their mummies unwrapped, their treasures scattered. But this forgotten boy king, whose name was struck from king lists, whose brief reign was considered insignificant, he alone survived intact into the modern world. Sometimes being forgotten is the greatest protection of all. Far from Egypt, across the Mediterranean Sea, there was once a civilization that built its greatest cities not on solid ground, but on water itself. The Minoans of Crete created something unprecedented in human history around 2000 BCE. While most ancient peoples huddled behind walls, terrified of invasion, the Minoans built palaces without fortifications. They created art celebrating nature, joy, and beauty, rather than war and conquest. The palace at Knossos sprawled across 6 acres. It wasn't just a palace, it was a city unto itself. Over 1,000 rooms, multiple stories, advanced plumbing with running waters and flush toilets, a sophisticated drainage system, light wells that brought sunshine deep into the interior chambers. The walls were painted with frescoes showing dolphins leaping through waves, young people vaulting over bulls, priestesses in elaborate dresses holding sacred snakes, gardens blooming with lilies and crocuses. There were no walls around Knossos, no defensive fortifications. The Minoans didn't build monuments to military victories because they didn't seem to wage war. Their power came from trade, from their navy that controlled the Aegean Sea. They were the first true maritime civilization, their ships carrying goods from Egypt to Syria, from Cyprus to the Greek mainland. But here's the mystery that has fascinated archaeologists for over a century. Around 1450 BCE, Minoan civilization suddenly collapsed. The palaces burned, the cities were abandoned. The sophisticated culture that had flourished for centuries simply ended. For years, scholars blamed a massive volcanic eruption on the island of Thera, modern-day Santorini. The eruption was catastrophic, one of the largest in human history. It buried the Minoan settlement on Thera under volcanic ash, preserving it like Pompeii would be preserved 1,500 years later. The tsunami generated by the eruption would have devastated Crete's northern coast. Ash would have poisoned crops. The sky would have darkened. But there's a problem with this theory. The eruption happened around 1600 BCE, a century and a half before the palaces burned. The Minoans recovered from the eruption. They rebuilt. They continued trading. So what destroyed them? The answer might lie in clay tablets found at Knossos, written in a script called Linear B. For decades after their discovery, no one could read these tablets. Then, in 1952, an architect named Michael Ventris did what professional linguists had failed to do. He deciphered Linear B, and the language he found wasn't Minoan, it was Greek. The tablets revealed that by the time the palaces burned, Knossos was being run by Greek-speaking Mycenaeans from the mainland. They had taken over the Minoan palaces, adopted their writing system, absorbed their culture. The Minoans hadn't been destroyed by a natural disaster. They had been conquered, their civilization absorbed into the rising Mycenaean world. But even this isn't the end of the story, because around 1200 BCE, the Mycenaeans themselves collapsed. Their palaces burned. Their cities were abandoned. Literacy disappeared from Greece for 400 years. Scholars call it the Bronze Age collapse, and it wasn't just the Mycenaeans. Across the eastern Mediterranean, great civilizations fell within a span of 50 years. The Hittite Empire, the Egyptian New Kingdom, cities in Syria and Canaan. Trade networks that had existed for centuries broke down. What caused it? We still don't know for sure. Climate change, drought, famine, invasion by mysterious sea peoples mentioned in Egyptian texts, internal rebellion, systems collapse, probably all of these factors combining into a perfect storm that ended an age. But lying at the bottom of this catastrophe, buried deepest in time, are the Minoans. The civilization that built palaces without walls, that celebrated beauty over power, that controlled the sea but didn't glorify conquest. They vanished so completely that by classical Greek times, they existed only in myth. The Greeks remembered Knossos as the labyrinth where King Minos kept the Minotaur, a monster half man and half bull. They remembered stories of a great king who ruled the seas. But they didn't remember the real Minoans, the people who painted dolphins on their walls and built the first flush toilets. Sometimes I think about those Minoan artists, carefully painting frescoes on wet plaster, working quickly before it dried, creating images of such beauty and life. They couldn't have known that 3,500 years later, people would stand in front of their work and marvel. They were just doing their job, decorating a palace, making something beautiful because that's what their culture valued. The frescoes survived the conquests, survived the collapse, survived millennia of abandonment. And now, when we look at them, we see a glimpse of a gentler ancient world, one that feels almost impossible given everything we know about history, violence, and power. In the city of Alexandria, on the northern coast of Egypt, there once stood a building that contained all human knowledge. Every book, every scroll, every written work that could be found was copied and stored in the great library. Scholars came from across the known world to study there. It was said that the library contained over 500,000 scrolls, and then it burned, and humanity lost centuries of knowledge. Except, that's not quite what happened. The truth is messier, sadder, and more complicated. The library was built around 300 BCE by Ptolemy the Once, one of Alexander the Great's generals who took control of Egypt after Alexander's death. His son, Ptolemy II, became obsessed with filling it. He had agents at every port, searching ships for books to copy. Any ship arriving in Alexandria's harbor had to surrender all books on board. The books were copied, and the originals were kept for the library. The ships received copies. Ptolemy paid top price for original works by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, and then kept those originals and sent copies back to Athens. The library became the intellectual center of the ancient world. Euclid wrote his Elements there, laying the foundation for geometry. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy. Aristarchus proposed that the Earth orbited the Sun, 1,700 years before Copernicus. Hero of Alexandria invented the first steam engine, though it was treated as a toy. Galen advanced medical knowledge. The list goes on. But no building from that era stands forever. The library wasn't destroyed in one dramatic fire. It declined slowly, damaged repeatedly over centuries. Julius Caesar's troops accidentally started a fire in 48 BCE that destroyed the docks area. Some scrolls were lost then. Various emperors and rulers neglected it, cut its funding, looted its contents. Christian mobs may have destroyed what remained in the 4th century CE. Arab conquerors found ruins in the 7th century. By then, the scrolls were long gone. But where did they go? Some were copied and survived in other libraries. Many were simply lost as the papyrus deteriorated, as fires started, as libraries were looted, as civilizations fell. We know titles of hundreds of lost works, histories, philosophies, scientific treatises, poems, plays. We know they existed because other ancient authors mentioned them, quote from them. But the works themselves are gone. Imagine what we've lost. 7 plays survive from Aeschylus out of 90 he wrote. 7 from Sophocles out of over 120. 18 from Euripides out of 92. The library had all of them. Complete works of authors we only know from fragments quoted by others. Scientific treatises that would have advanced human knowledge by centuries if they had survived. There's a saying that history is written by the victors, but that's not quite right. History is written by those whose writings survive, and survival is mostly luck. A book survives because it's copied, and it's copied because someone finds it valuable. And what's found valuable changes with time and fashion. Most ancient books were written on papyrus made from pressed reeds. Papyrus is fragile. It deteriorates in moisture. It burns easily. The only reason we have any ancient papyrus documents at all is because they were preserved in extremely dry conditions, the deserts of Egypt, buried in sand. Everywhere else, everything written on papyrus before about 400 CE is essentially gone. Later works were copied onto parchment, made from animal skins. Parchment lasts longer, but it's expensive. A single Bible required the skins of over 200 sheep or goats. So when medieval monks needed parchment, they would often scrape the writing off old manuscripts and reuse them. These are called palimpsests. Using special imaging techniques, modern scholars can sometimes read the scraped-off text underneath. Sometimes it's just an old legal document. Sometimes it's Archimedes' mathematical theories that were lost for 1,000 years, written under a medieval prayer book. The loss of the Library of Alexandria is really the loss of ancient knowledge in general. It's a symbol of how fragile human knowledge is, how easily it can be lost. We stand on the shoulders of giants, yes, but many of those giants fell and we don't even know their names. There's something haunting about lost knowledge. We know it existed. We know people spent their lives creating it. We can see ancient authors referencing works we no longer have, arguing against ideas we can only guess at from context. It's like listening to one side of a phone conversation. You can infer some of what the other person is saying, but you're always missing half the picture. And this isn't just ancient history. We're still losing knowledge. Languages die, taking with them unique ways of understanding the world. Oral traditions vanish when the last speaker of a language passes away. Digital files become unreadable as software and hardware become obsolete. We think we're better at preserving knowledge now, but we're really just creating new ways to lose it. The scholars at Alexandria didn't think they were creating something temporary. They were building for eternity. They believed that by gathering all human knowledge in one place, they were ensuring it would never be lost. Instead, they created a single point of failure. When the library declined, everything declined with it. Maybe the lesson isn't to build one great library. Maybe it's to copy everything, to spread knowledge as widely as possible, to make sure it exists in many places, in many forms, so that when one version is lost, as it inevitably will be, others survive. In the Four Corners region of North America, where Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico meet, there are cities built into cliffs. Entire pueblos constructed in natural alcoves, hundreds of feet above the canyon floor. Stone walls, multiple stories, hundreds of rooms. They're called the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, and they're some of the most remarkable architectural achievements in North America. The ancestral Puebloans built them in the late 1100s CE. For less than a century, people lived in these cliff cities. They farmed the mesa tops above, growing corn and beans and squash. They created intricate pottery. They built sophisticated structures with precise astronomical alignments. Their civilization had existed in the region for over 1,000 years, and then, in the late 1200s, they left. All of them. Within a generation, the cliff dwellings were empty. The people didn't die. They migrated south, becoming the ancestors of modern Pueblo peoples. But why did they leave? For a long time, the mystery seemed simple. Drought. Tree ring studies show a severe drought from 1276 to 1299. Crops would have failed. Water sources would have dried up. People had to leave to survive. But it's more complicated than that. The ancestral Puebloans had survived droughts before. They had centuries of experience managing water in this harsh environment. They built check dams and terraces. They had diverse food sources. So why did this drought break them? Recent research suggests it wasn't just the drought, it was the social pressure it created. When resources become scarce, human societies don't just quietly decline, they fracture. There's evidence of increased violence in the final decades before the migration. Burned buildings, unburied bodies, people dying violent deaths. The careful archaeological record shows a society under extreme stress. The cliff dwellings themselves might have been defensive, building hundreds of feet up a cliff face, requiring ladders to access, makes sense if you're afraid of attack. These weren't leisurely constructed over generations. They were built quickly, urgently, in just a few decades at the end of the civilization's time in the region. Imagine the decision to leave. These people had lived in this landscape for 1,000 years. Every canyon, every spring, every rock formation had meaning, stories, sacred significance. Their ancestors were buried there. Their entire world was there. But the crops were failing year after year. Violence was increasing. Neighbors who had traded peacefully for centuries were now threats. The social fabric was tearing apart. So they left. Families, clans, entire communities packed what they could carry and walked south. They left behind their homes, their pottery, their entire built environment. Some of their descendants live in pueblos along the Rio Grande today. They maintain cultural traditions that stretch back to Mesa Verde and beyond. They remember. But here's what keeps me awake. This wasn't a primitive society that failed. This was a sophisticated civilization with advanced architecture, agriculture, astronomy, art. They had successfully adapted to one of the harshest environments in North America for a millennium. And still, when conditions became harsh enough, when social stress became high enough, the society couldn't hold together. We see this pattern repeatedly in archaeology. Civilizations don't usually end with a bang. They end with a whimper. People just leave. They migrate away from failing centers. The cities empty gradually, then suddenly. The great buildings become ruins. The sophisticated technologies are forgotten. And within a few generations, descendant peoples sometimes don't even remember their ancestors built those ruins. The cliff dwellings stood empty for 600 years before European American explorers discovered them in the late 1800s. In that time, wind and weather had degraded them. Looters had taken artifacts. But the basic structures remained, testament to the skill of their builders. Today, you can visit Mesa Verde. You can stand in those ancient rooms, look out through doorways at the canyon below, touch walls built by hands that vanished 800 years ago. The buildings are silent now. No children playing, no women grinding corn, no men returning from the fields. Just stone and silence, and the wind through the canyons. The ancestral Puebloans didn't disappear. Their descendants are very much alive and maintain living cultures. But that particular society, in that particular place, ended. The cliff dwellings stand as monuments to both human achievement and human fragility. In the dense jungles of Guatemala, Honduras, Belize, and southern Mexico, there are pyramids, hundreds of them, some taller than 15-story buildings, covered in carvings of kings and gods and cosmic events, surrounded by palaces, ball courts, astronomical observatories, and vast plazas that could hold thousands of people. The Maya built one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the ancient world. They developed the only complete writing system in the pre-Columbian Americas. Their mathematics included the concept of zero, independently invented. Their astronomical observations were so precise, they could predict eclipses centuries in advance. Their long count calendar tracked time across millions of years. And then, well, that's the mystery. The great Maya cities in the southern lowlands were abandoned in the 9th century CE. Not all at once, but in a cascade of collapse that lasted about a century. Tikal, Copan, Palenque, cities that had stood for centuries, that had populations in the tens of thousands, that were centers of art and learning, they were left to the jungle. Unlike other civilizations we've discussed, we can actually read what the Maya wrote. Their hieroglyphic script was deciphered in the late 20th century, one of the great intellectual achievements of modern archaeology. We can read their history, their royal genealogies, their records of wars and alliances and astronomical events. And what we read is fascinating and terrible. The Maya weren't one unified empire. They were a collection of city-states, constantly warring with each other. Kings needed military victories to maintain their power and demonstrate their divine sanction. Captives from rival cities were tortured and sacrificed in elaborate public rituals. The Maya inscriptions don't shy away from this. They boast about it. Flint and shield is a common glyph, representing warfare. Kings are shown trampling captives or scattering their blood as offerings to the gods. This wasn't sustainable. By the 8th century, population in the southern lowlands had reached levels that pushed the environment to its limits. The Maya had transformed the jungle, cutting forests to make agricultural fields, building terraces and irrigation systems. But the limestone bedrock of the region meant that agriculture degraded the soil quickly. Farming became harder even as the population continued to grow, and the warfare intensified. The inscriptions from the final decades show cities attacking each other with increased frequency. Alliances shifted. Trade networks broke down. The careful balance of power that had maintained regional stability for centuries collapsed. A severe drought from about 800 to 900 CE was probably the final straw. Crops failed. Cities couldn't feed their populations. The kings couldn't maintain their claims to divine power when they couldn't even ensure food and water. Political authority collapsed. People moved away from the great cities to smaller settlements where they could survive. The jungle reclaimed the cities rapidly. Trees grew from the tops of pyramids. Vines covered carved facades. Within a few centuries, the great plazas were buried under soil and vegetation. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 1500s, they found Maya people still living in the region, but the great cities were already ancient ruins, their history forgotten even by the descendants of the people who built them. It wasn't until the 19th century that European and American explorers began rediscovering these ruins. Early explorers thought they had found evidence of Egyptian or Phoenician colonization. They couldn't believe that indigenous Americans had built such sophisticated cities. This racist assumption delayed understanding of Maya civilization for decades. Even today, the Maya ruins keep revealing secrets. Lighter technology, using lasers to map terrain through jungle canopy, has revealed thousands of previously unknown structures. Whole cities were hidden under what looked like natural hills. The scale of Maya civilization was far greater than anyone imagined. In 2018, LiDAR mapping in Guatemala revealed over 60,000 previously unknown structures, suggesting the Maya population in that region alone may have been over 10 million at its height. We're still learning to read the inscriptions. Each deciphered glyph opens new understanding of Maya thought, history, and culture. We know the names of kings who ruled over 1,000 years ago. We know their birthdays, their accession dates, their military victories, their building projects, even some of their personal conflicts and family dramas. But here's what haunts me about the Maya. They knew they were in trouble. The inscriptions from the final decades show an awareness of crisis. Kings made increasingly desperate offerings to the gods. They built more temples, performed more sacrifices, tried everything in their power to restore the cosmic order they believed maintained their world. The last dated inscription at most sites is usually on a monument that was never completed. Work just stopped. The Maya didn't disappear. There are over 7 million Maya people today, maintaining languages and cultural traditions that connect directly to the ancient cities. But the classic Maya civilization, that particular configuration of city-states, that fluorescence of art and architecture and writing, ended. The cities were abandoned to the jungle. Walking through Maya ruins today, you feel the weight of time. You can climb pyramids that were already ancient when the Aztec Empire was young. You can stand in plazas where kings once danced in jaguar costumes, performing rituals to maintain the cosmic order. You can see ball courts where the Maya played their sacred game, sometimes ending in human sacrifice. You can touch carved stone inscriptions that tell stories of long-dead rulers, and you can feel the jungle pressing in, always ready to reclaim what humans built. The trees grow slowly but inevitably, their roots breaking apart carefully fitted stones. The rain erodes carved surfaces. Time dissolves everything eventually. In 1974, farmers digging a well in Shanxi Province, China, struck something hard: clay. And then more clay. And then a life-sized clay warrior, perfectly detailed, still holding a bronze weapon. They had discovered the tomb complex of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of unified China, and accompanying him in death was an army. Over 8,000 life-size terracotta warriors, each one unique, each one individually crafted with distinct features, hairstyles, and expressions. The terracotta army is one of the most stunning archaeological discoveries of the modern era, but it's also a window into an empire built on unprecedented ambition and unprecedented brutality. Qin Shi Huang unified China in 221 BCE, ending centuries of warfare between rival states. He standardized writing, currency, weights and measures, and even the width of cart axles so that vehicles would fit in the same ruts across his empire. He connected and expanded defensive walls that would eventually become the Great Wall. He built roads and canals that facilitated trade and military movement. He also burned books, buried scholars alive, and enforced his will through a harsh legal code that punished even minor infractions with death or mutilation. His empire was built on legalism, the philosophy that humans are naturally selfish and must be controlled through strict laws and severe punishments. The terracotta army was just one part of his tomb complex. Ancient historians wrote that the tomb itself, still unexcavated beneath a massive burial mound, contains rivers of mercury, a ceiling decorated with pearls representing stars, and crossbows set to automatically fire at intruders. Recent testing has found mercury concentrations in the soil around the mound, suggesting those ancient accounts might be true. The emperor believed in life after death, but not in a spiritual sense. He believed that the afterlife was simply a continuation of earthly life, so he prepared for it by building a complete miniature version of his empire to take with him. Not just the army. There are terracotta musicians, acrobats, officials, servants. There are clay horses and chariots. There are real bronze weapons, still sharp after over 2,000 years. Creating this took a massive labor force working for decades. An estimated 700,000 workers were involved in constructing the tomb complex. Many were convicted criminals, sent to forced labor as punishment. Others were conscripted farmers and artisans. Ancient sources say that the workers who built the inner tomb were sealed inside when it was finished, killed to protect its secrets. The emperor died in 210 BCE during a tour of his empire. His death was kept secret for months, while his advisors maneuvered for power. When news finally broke, rebellion erupted almost immediately. The Qin dynasty, which the emperor believed would last 10,000 generations, fell just 4 years after his death. But the terracotta warriors remained, buried and forgotten. That's the tomb complex was looted shortly after the dynasty fell. Many of the bronze weapons were stolen, which is why many warriors stand empty-handed today. Then it was simply lost. 2,000 years passed. The site became farmland. People plowed fields directly above thousands of clay warriors. When the warriors were finally discovered, excavation revealed something unexpected. They weren't originally gray clay. They were painted in bright colors, reds, blues, greens, purples, but the pigments were organic and unstable. When exposed to air after 2 millennia underground, they dried and flaked off within minutes. The first warriors excavated lost their paint before archaeologists even realized it was there. Now, excavation proceeds slowly and carefully. New preservation techniques allow some paint to be saved, but large sections of the tomb complex remain unexcavated, protected, until better preservation methods are developed. The tomb chamber itself has never been opened. It waits beneath its mound, sealed for over 2,000 years, guarded by its clay army. Each warrior is different because each was individually crafted by a particular artisan. Their ears are especially distinctive. No two are alike. Researchers believe different workshops created different components, which were then assembled. The level of standardization suggests a sophisticated production system, almost like an assembly line, but the individual artisan touches remain visible in details, a slightly different expression, a unique hand position, particular armor decorations. The warriors weren't meant to be seen. They were buried with the emperor, sealed in underground vaults, intended only for the afterlife. No living person after the dynasty's fall was supposed to see them ever again. But now millions of people have viewed them. They've become symbols of China, reproductions displayed in museums worldwide. The private army of a dead tyrant has become a public treasure. There's an irony there. The emperor built his tomb to ensure his personal immortality, to allow him to continue his rule in the afterlife. Instead, his empire immediately collapsed after his death. His legacy was one of tyranny, but the warriors he created to serve him in death have made him immortal in a way he never imagined. Not as a ruler, but as an archaeological wonder, not through power, but through art. The Terracotta Army stands as a monument to both human achievement and human cost. The artistry is undeniable. These are masterworks of sculpture, each one an individual portrait. The organizational complexity required to produce them demonstrates sophisticated administrative systems, but they also represent forced labor, authoritarian control, and a ruler so obsessed with death that he mobilized hundreds of thousands of people to prepare for it. In the quiet exhibition halls where the warriors now stand, you can look into the faces of men who lived over 2,000 years ago, each face unique, each capturing something of individual humanity, even though they were mass-produced for a despot. The artists who made them are long dead, their names lost to history, but their work survives, giving face to the faceless past. On Easter Island, one of the most remote inhabited islands on Earth, there stand nearly 1,000 massive stone statues. The moai, as they're called, are carved from compressed volcanic ash. They weigh up to 82 tons. Some are over 30 feet tall. They have elongated faces, prominent noses, and deep eye sockets. And somehow, the ancient Polynesian people who settled this tiny island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean carved them, moved them, and erected them around the island's perimeter. Easter Island, or Rapa Nui as its inhabitants call it, is over 2,000 miles from the nearest continental shore. It's one of the most isolated places where humans have ever lived. When Polynesian voyagers first arrived, probably around 1200 CE, they found an island covered in palm forests, filled with birds, surrounded by fish-rich waters. The moai were created over several centuries, mostly between 1400 and 1600 CE. They were carved in a volcanic crater called Rano Raraku, which served as the statue quarry. Nearly 400 moai remain there in various stages of completion, some still attached to the bedrock, giving us insights into the carving process. Creating a moai took a team of carvers about a year of work. They used stone hand axes to slowly carve the statue from the volcanic rock. The statues were carved on their backs, still attached to the bedrock. Only when the front and sides were complete would workers carve underneath, slowly separating the statue from the rock. Then came the challenge, moving these massive statues across the island. Some were transported over 10 miles from the quarry to their final locations. For decades, archaeologists debated how this was accomplished. Some proposed wooden rollers. Others suggested sleds pulled by ropes. In 2012, a team demonstrated that moai could be walked upright by rocking them side to side while tilted forward, like moving a refrigerator. This method matched local oral traditions that said the moai walked to their locations. Once in place, the moai were erected on stone platforms called ahu. The statues faced inland, looking over the villages they protected. They represented ancestors, embodying the spiritual power or mana of important chiefs. Some had cylindrical stone top knots placed on their heads, carved from red volcanic rock and weighing up to 12 tons. Originally, the statues had coral eyes with obsidian or red scoria pupils, giving them a lifelike gaze. But at some point, moai construction stopped. The statues in the quarry were abandoned mid-carving. Many moai that had been erected were deliberately toppled. When European explorers arrived in 1722, they found the island mostly deforested and the population much smaller than the island could have supported. The statues lay fallen on tsitsas, their platforms. What happened? The traditional narrative, popularized by Jared Diamond in Collapse, was that the islanders overexploited their resources. They cut down all the palm trees, partly to move moai. Without trees, they couldn't build fishing canoes, couldn't prevent soil erosion. Bird populations collapsed. Food became scarce. Society fell into warfare and possibly cannibalism. The Moai obsession had destroyed the civilization. But recent research complicates this story. The islanders were adapting to environmental change, not causing catastrophic collapse. They shifted to rock gardens, which actually improved agricultural productivity. They developed chicken farming to replace marine protein. Population didn't peak until around 1600, well after the forest was mostly gone. The real catastrophe came from outside. When Europeans arrived, they brought diseases. Smallpox epidemics devastated the population. In the 1860s, Peruvian slave raiders captured and removed over 1,500 islanders, nearly a third of the population, including most of the chiefs and priests who held cultural knowledge. When international pressure forced Peru to return survivors, they brought smallpox back with them, triggering more epidemics. By 1877, only 111 native Rapa Nui people survived. The toppling of Moai may have occurred during these catastrophic times, as traditional beliefs failed to protect the people from European diseases and violence. Or it may have begun earlier, during interclan warfare exacerbated by resource stress. Or it may have been a deliberate rejection of the old religious system. We don't know for certain. What we do know is that the Rapa Nui people survived. Their culture continues today. Modern islanders have worked to restore Moai, re-erecting statues on their platforms. The island is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Rapa Nui language and traditions are being revitalized after decades of suppression. The Moai themselves remain enigmatic. Standing before one, you're struck by its presence. These aren't crude idols. They're sophisticated sculptures, capturing something essential about the human face while also being distinctly stylized. The skill required to carve them from hard volcanic rock using only stone tools is remarkable, and there were nearly 1,000 of them. Imagine the dedication required. Generation after generation of carvers, perfecting their techniques, passing knowledge down. The social organization needed to support that many specialized craftsmen, the religious conviction that motivated such immense effort. The quarry at Rano-Raraku is perhaps the most haunting part of the island. Hundreds of Moai in various stages of completion, frozen in time. Some are nearly finished, just days away from being separated from the bedrock. Others are barely started, rough shapes emerging from stone. It's like walking through a sculptor's workshop abandoned mid-project, except the workshop is a volcanic crater and the project lasted. For centuries, one Moai still in the quarry would have been over 70 feet tall and weighed over 200 tons if completed. It was never finished. We don't know why work stopped on this giant or on the hundreds of others left incomplete, but they remain silent witnesses to ambitions that exceeded completion. Beneath the rolling landscape of Cappadocia in central Turkey, there are entire cities carved into soft volcanic rock. Not buildings, cities, multiple levels deep, with rooms, corridors, ventilation shafts, wells, and spaces for thousands of people. The largest, Derinkuyu, extends more than 200 feet underground and could shelter up to 20,000 people along with their livestock and food stores. These weren't simple caves. They were sophisticated underground complexes with specific rooms for different purposes: wine presses, stables for animals, storage chambers for food, meeting halls, even chapels. The ventilation system brought fresh air to the deepest levels. Rolling stone doors, weighing up to half a ton, could seal off sections from inside, protecting inhabitants from invasion. But here's the mystery. We don't know who first built them, or when, or exactly why. The soft volcanic tuff of Cappadocia is easy to carve but hardens when exposed to air, making it ideal for underground construction. People have been modifying caves and carving homes in this region for thousands of years. The underground cities likely began as simple caves that were gradually expanded over many generations. By the Byzantine period, around 600-800 CE, Christians fleeing Arab raids were definitely using and expanding these cities. Historical records mention them, but some scholars think the city's origins go back much further, perhaps to the Hittites in the Bronze Age, or to the Phrygians in the Iron Age. Carbon dating of organic materials found in the cities suggests use spanning at least 2,000 years. Imagine living underground for weeks or months at a time, descending through narrow tunnels with your family, your neighbors, your animals, the oil lamps flickering, the air cool and still. Above, invading armies sweeping across the landscape. Below, an entire community waiting in darkness for the danger to pass. The cities weren't meant for permanent habitation. They were refuges, places to hide during invasions. Life above ground was normal until enemies approached. Then the population would retreat underground, sealing the stone doors behind them, waiting in their carved chambers until it was safe to emerge. Over 200 underground cities have been discovered in Cappadocia, and more are likely waiting to be found. Some are connected by tunnels stretching for miles, allowing communication and movement between settlements even while under siege. The full extent of this underground network is still being mapped. In Derinkuyu, you can visit some of the levels today. You descend through narrow passages, ducking under low ceilings, moving through spaces carved out of rock, by hands that worked centuries or millennia ago. You see the ventilation shafts extending down through multiple levels. You see the stone doors still in position, their pivot holes worn smooth by use. You see the small chapels where people prayed in darkness, waiting for deliverance. There's something primal about being underground, enclosed in stone, protected, but also trapped. The cities represent both safety and confinement. They allowed populations to survive repeated invasions and raids. But they also represent a world so dangerous that people needed to literally go underground to escape it. The last major use of the cities was probably in the early 1900s, when Greek Christians in the region faced persecution. But after the population exchange between Greece and Turkey in 1923, the cities were abandoned. They were rediscovered by accident in 1963 when a man in Derinkuyu, renovating his house, knocked down a wall and found a room behind it. That room led to a tunnel. That tunnel led to an entire underground city that had been forgotten for decades, its entrances sealed and covered over. Now the cities are tourist attractions. Thousands of people visit each year, descending briefly into the depths, marveling at the engineering and ambition, then returning to daylight. But for centuries, these were lifelines, the difference between survival and destruction for communities living in a contested borderland. The builders left no inscriptions, no written records explaining their work. The cities themselves are the only testimony, carved testimony in stone. Anonymous hands creating shelter for anonymous families, repeated across generations, gradually expanding simple caves into vast underground complexes. It's a different kind of monument than a pyramid or a temple. It's a monument to survival rather than power, to hiding rather than displaying, to community effort rather than royal ambition. On the Indus River in modern-day Pakistan and northwestern India, there was once a civilization that rivaled ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia in size and sophistication. Between about 2600 and 1900 BCE, the Indus Valley Civilization built planned cities with grid patterns, sophisticated drainage systems, standardized brick sizes, and public baths. Their largest cities, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, housed tens of thousands of people. The cities show remarkable urban planning. Streets laid out in precise grid patterns. Houses with private wells and bathrooms. Wastewater systems with covered drains running along every street. Public buildings that may have been administrative centers or granaries. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro, a large public bathing facility built with waterproofed bricks, suggests ritual purification practices. The Indus people traded with Mesopotamia. Indus seals have been found in Sumerian cities. They worked with bronze, created beautiful pottery, made jewelry from gold and precious stones. They used standardized weights and measures, suggesting well-organized trade and administration. And they had writing. Thousands of seals and tablets have been found with inscriptions in the Indus script, short sequences of symbols, usually accompanied by images of animals or human figures. The script has about 400 distinct signs, suggesting it represents a language rather than just pictograms, but nobody can read it. The Indus script is one of the great undeciphered writing systems. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphics or Mesopotamian cuneiform, we don't have a Rosetta Stone, no bilingual text that would give us a key to translation. We don't even know what language it represents. Scholars have tried for decades to decipher it. Some think it's related to Dravidian languages still spoken in southern India. Others suggest connections to Indo-European languages. Some argue it's not actually writing at all, but just religious or political symbols. This last claim is controversial, and most scholars disagree, but it shows how difficult the problem is. The script disappeared when the civilization declined around 1900 BCE. The cities were gradually abandoned. Trade with Mesopotamia ceased. The sophisticated urban culture gave way to smaller, simpler settlements. Whatever knowledge the Indus people had, their literature, their history, their religious texts, their scientific understanding, died with their script. We can see what they built. We can analyze their trade goods, their tools, their city plans, but we can't hear their voices. We don't know what they called themselves, what gods they worshipped, what stories they told, what they believed about the world. All of that is locked in undeciphered symbols on small stone seals. It's frustrating because we're so close. The seals exist. The symbols are clear. We just can't understand them. It's like finding a library where all the books are written in an unknown language. The knowledge is there, preserved, but inaccessible. Some scholars believe that if we found just one longer text, something more than the brief inscriptions on seals, it might be enough to crack the code. But such a text hasn't been found. Maybe it never existed. Maybe the Indus people used perishable materials like palm leaves for longer writings, and those have all decayed in the humid climate. Or maybe there simply weren't longer texts. Maybe the script was only used for brief labels, ownership marks, administrative notations. Maybe the Indus civilization operated without extensive written records, maintaining their sophisticated culture through oral tradition and practical knowledge, passed down through apprenticeship. The decline of the Indus civilization is another mystery. Unlike the Maya or the Minoans, there's no clear evidence of warfare, drought, or invasion. The cities weren't burned or violently destroyed. They were just abandoned. People gradually moved away over several centuries. Some scholars point to climate change. The rivers may have shifted course, or monsoon patterns changed, making the region less suitable for agriculture. Others suggest that trade disruptions led to economic decline. Maybe the centralized authority that planned and maintained the cities weakened, and without that coordination, the urban system couldn't sustain itself. Whatever the cause, by 1300 BCE, the Indus script had been forgotten. The cities were buried by soil and flood deposits. 3,000 years later, in the 1920s, archaeologists rediscovered them. They found the planned streets, the sophisticated drainage, the seals with their mysterious writing. They realized that South Asia had an ancient civilization that nobody in modern times remembered. The Indus Valley civilization had vanished so completely that even its closest descendants didn't remember it. When modern archaeologists started excavating, local people didn't connect the ruins to their own history. It was lost knowledge, recovered only through archaeology. This happens more than you might think. Civilizations fall, and within a few generations, they're forgotten. The physical ruins remain, but the living connection to the past breaks. People walk past ancient mounds without knowing cities lie beneath them. They plow fields that cover palaces. The past becomes literally buried under the present. The Indus seals sit in museums now, displayed behind glass. The symbols are clearly visible, each seal a small mystery, a message sent across 4,000 years that we still can't read. Somewhere in those symbols is information, names, places, transactions, beliefs, but it remains silent, waiting for someone to finally understand. In the Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg, Russia, there was once a room covered entirely in amber panels backed with gold leaf and mirrors. The Amber Room, created in the early 18th century, was called the eighth wonder of the world. 6 tons of amber went into its construction. Amber panels, amber sculptures, amber carvings. The room glowed with warm, honey-golden light, transforming as the sun moved across the sky, as candles flickered at night. It was a gift from Prussia to Russia, a symbol of alliance. The panels were installed in the Catherine Palace in 1755. For nearly 2 centuries, it was one of the great treasures of the Russian czars, a showpiece for visitors, a marvel of artistic achievement. Then came World War II. As Nazi forces advanced on Leningrad in 1941, Soviet curators tried to evacuate the palace's treasures. But the Amber Room presented a problem. The amber panels were fragile, mounted on walls, difficult to remove without damage. Instead, the Soviets tried to hide the room. They covered the amber with wallpaper, hoping the Nazis wouldn't notice. It didn't work. Nazi art experts knew about the Amber Room. They carefully dismantled it, packed the panels into crates, and shipped everything to Königsberg, modern Kaliningrad, in East Prussia. The amber was installed in Königsberg Castle, where it was displayed for 2 years. In 1944, as Allied bombing intensified and Soviet forces advanced, the amber was packed up again. Then, it disappeared. Königsberg Castle was heavily damaged by bombing and then burned. After the war, Soviet investigators searched extensively for the Amber Room. They interrogated German officials, art experts, anyone who might know where the amber had gone, but nobody could tell them. Was it destroyed in the bombing, buried in a secret location, smuggled out of Germany? For decades, treasure hunters searched. Credible reports placed fragments in various locations, but nothing substantial was ever found. The entire Amber Room, 6 tons of amber panels, had simply vanished. The mystery became legendary. Books were written about it. Theories multiplied. Some claimed it was in a mine shaft in Germany. Others insisted it had been loaded on a ship that sank. Some believed it was hidden in a secret bunker somewhere in former East Prussia. The search continued for decades, driven by treasure hunters, historians, and governments. In 1979, the Soviet government decided to recreate the Amber Room. It took 24 years and cost millions of dollars. Russian craftsmen studied old photographs and documents, relearning techniques that hadn't been used in centuries. They hand-carved amber pieces, matched colors, recreated the intricate designs. In 2003, the reconstructed Amber Room was unveiled in the Catherine Palace. It's beautiful. It glows with that same warm amber light. But it's not the original. The original Amber Room, with its history spanning 3 centuries, its craftsmanship from the 1700s, its particular amber pieces selected by 18th century artisans. That's gone. Or is it? Hope persists that the original might still be found. In 1997, German police recovered 1 amber piece confirmed to be from the original room. It had been sold by a German soldier's family. This proved that at least some of the amber survived the war. But where was the rest? The most likely scenario is that the amber was destroyed, either by bombing, by the castle fire, or deliberately by Nazi officials who didn't want it captured by Soviet forces. Amber is organic and flammable. If the crates were caught in the fire, they would have burned completely, leaving no trace. But the romance of lost treasure is hard to resist. Somewhere, maybe, in a forgotten bunker or a sealed mine shaft, the original Amber Room waits to be rediscovered. 6 tons of glowing golden amber, panels that once adorned a palace, now hidden in darkness. The story of the Amber Room is about more than lost treasure. It's about how war destroys cultural heritage, about how human conflicts erase beauty. The original creators spent years making something magnificent, something that brought joy to everyone who saw it. War destroyed it in an instant, and it's about memory and reconstruction. The new Amber Room shows that even when originals are lost, the human impulse to create beauty persists. Modern craftsmen dedicated decades to recreating something they'd never seen in person, working from photographs and descriptions, trying to recapture what was lost. It's not the same, but it's still meaningful. Throughout history, so much beauty has been lost to war, fire, neglect, and time. The Amber Room is just one example among thousands, but it's become symbolic, a perfect encapsulation of how human conflict destroys human achievement, and how we keep trying to rebuild, to restore, to remember what was lost. In the middle of Uzbekistan, far from any ocean, there are rusted ships sitting on sand. The Aral Sea, once the world's fourth largest lake, has almost completely disappeared. The ships that once sailed its waters now rest on dry land, monuments to one of history's worst environmental disasters. This isn't ancient history. In the 1960s, the Aral Sea was still a vast body of water, about the size of Ireland. It supported a fishing industry, provided water for irrigation, moderated the local climate. The cities around it were thriving ports. The Soviet government decided to transform Central Asia into a cotton-growing region. They diverted the two major rivers feeding the Aral Sea into irrigation canals. The plan worked, cotton production soared, but the Aral Sea began to shrink. At first, it seemed manageable. The sea's level dropped slowly. But there's a tipping point with water systems. Once the Aral Sea shrank past a certain point, the evaporation rate exceeded the inflow. The shrinking accelerated. By 1987, the sea had split into two bodies of water. By 2014, the eastern basin had dried up completely. The environmental consequences were catastrophic. As the lake shrank, its salinity increased, killing fish. The fishing industry collapsed. Fishing towns became landlocked. Ships were left stranded, sometimes miles from any water. The exposed lakebed became a salt desert. Windstorms now carry salt and pesticide residues from the dried lakebed across the region, affecting human health and agriculture for hundreds of miles. The climate changed too. The sea had moderated temperatures, cooler summers, warmer winters. Without it, the region experiences more extreme heat and cold. Growing seasons shortened. Some crops can no longer be grown. This all happened within a single human lifetime. People who remember fishing on the Aral Sea are still alive. They remember when the water reached the shore, when their towns were ports, when the sea provided a living for tens of thousands of families. Now, they live in a desert, surrounded by salt flats and rusted ships. The ships are haunting. They sit on sand, sometimes in clusters like a fleet anchored far from water. Their hulls are rusted, their paint faded. Some have been scavenged for metal. Others remain largely intact, monuments to a sea that no longer exists. This isn't really an ancient civilization story. It's too recent. But it belongs here because it shows how quickly human actions can erase established systems. The Aral Sea had existed for thousands of years. Civilizations rose and fell around it. And then, in just a few decades of the 20th century, human intervention destroyed it. There's a particular cruelty to environmental disasters like this. They unfold gradually enough that adaptation seems possible, but rapidly enough that by the time the full consequences are clear, it's too late to reverse course. The Soviet planners knew the sea was shrinking, but they prioritized cotton production over environmental concerns. They believed technology could solve any problems that arose. They were wrong. Some restoration efforts are underway now. A dam completed in 2005 has helped the northern portion of the sea partially recover. Water levels there have risen slightly, salinity has decreased, and some fish species have returned. But the larger southern basin is likely gone forever. It's too far from any water source to refill. It's now the Araukam Desert, a new desert created within living memory. The ships remain, too heavy and too damaged to move. They've become tourist attractions of a sort, symbols of human hubris and environmental destruction. Photographers come to capture images of vessels stranded impossibly far from water. The pictures are striking, almost surreal. Ships belong in water. Seeing them on dry land, on sand and salt, creates cognitive dissonance. In thousands of years, if these ships survive, archaeologists might excavate them from sand dunes. They might puzzle over why ships were found so far inland. They might develop theories about ancient sea levels or climate shifts. They probably wouldn't guess the truth, that humans deliberately drained an entire sea within a few decades for cotton production. The Aral Sea disaster is a reminder that civilization-ending catastrophes don't always come from drought or invasion or plague. Sometimes they come from our own short-sighted decisions, from prioritizing immediate gains over long-term consequences, from believing we can engineer nature without unforeseen repercussions. Around 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed almost simultaneously. The Mycenaean palaces in Greece burned and were abandoned. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia fell. Egyptian power declined sharply. Cities across Syria and Canaan were destroyed. Trade networks that had connected these civilizations for centuries broke down. Literacy disappeared from Greece for 400 years. It's called the Bronze Age collapse, and it remains one of history's great mysteries. What could cause such widespread, simultaneous destruction across multiple civilizations? Ancient texts provide some clues. Egyptian sources mention invasions by sea peoples, groups of maritime raiders whose origins remain unclear. The Egyptians fought them off, but barely. Other civilizations weren't so lucky. Hittite texts from the final years show desperate pleas for grain shipments. They were starving. Letters found at Ugarit, a Syrian coastal city, show awareness of approaching danger in the weeks before the city's destruction. But were the Sea Peoples cause or symptom? Some scholars argue they were refugees from collapsing civilizations elsewhere, not invaders causing collapse. Others point to evidence of drought. Tree ring data shows decreased rainfall across the eastern Mediterranean for decades. Failed crops, famine, societal stress, population movements. There's also evidence of earthquake activity. Many destroyed cities show signs of seismic damage. A earthquake storm, a series of major earthquakes over several decades, could have destroyed cities, interrupted trade, created refugees. And there are signs of internal problems. The Bronze Age kingdoms were highly centralized, with palace bureaucracies controlling production and distribution. This system was efficient in good times, but fragile. When trade disrupted or crops failed, the whole system could collapse rapidly. Some scholars point to evidence of internal rebellions in the final decades. The truth is, probably all of these factors combining into a perfect storm. Climate stress causing crop failures, earthquakes destroying cities, trade disruptions creating shortages, famine driving population movements, raiders attacking weakened cities, internal rebellions against failing authorities. Each problem making the others worse, cascading into systemic collapse. The Bronze Age civilizations were more interconnected than often realized. They traded with each other constantly. Copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, gold from Nubia, grain from Egypt, timber from Lebanon, pottery from Greece. When one system weakened, it affected them all. The collapse spread through the trade networks that had connected these societies. For the people living through it, the end must have seemed apocalyptic. Cities that had stood for centuries burned. Trade goods that had always been available vanished. The elaborate palace bureaucracies that organized life disappeared. Reading and writing were forgotten in some regions. Population declined sharply as people died from violence, starvation, and disease, or migrated away from collapsing centers. But it wasn't actually the end. New societies emerged from the ruins. The Phoenicians in Lebanon became great maritime traders. The Israelites established kingdoms in Canaan. Greek-speaking peoples settled throughout Greece, eventually developing the classical Greek civilization. Iron gradually replaced bronze as the primary metal for tools and weapons, partly because the collapse disrupted access to tin, necessary for bronze making, but iron ore was more widely available. The Dark Age that followed lasted about 400 years in Greece. That's a long time, longer than the United States has existed. Multiple generations living in a world diminished from what came before. Stories of the palatial past survived in oral traditions, eventually written down in Homer's epics. The Greeks remembered there had once been great kingdoms, heroic warriors, cities full of gold. They just didn't know those stories were historically true until modern archaeology rediscovered Mycenaean civilization. The Bronze Age collapse shows how interconnected societies can create systemic vulnerabilities. When everything is connected, problems anywhere affect everywhere. Local disasters become regional catastrophes. The very trade networks and political connections that enabled prosperity also spread collapse. It also shows how resilient humans are. The collapse was devastating, but it wasn't extinction. People survived. They adapted to new conditions. They eventually rebuilt, creating new forms of social organization, new technologies, new cultures. The post-collapse world was different from what came before, but in some ways it was more dynamic, more innovative, less rigidly hierarchical. Standing in the ruins of these Bronze Age palaces today, at Mycenae or Tiryns in Greece, at Hattusa in Turkey, at Ugarit in Syria, you can see the burned layers, the violent endings. But you can also see that the ruins sit in landscapes still inhabited, in regions where civilization continued. The palaces fell, but humanity endured. We're nearing the end of our journey through ancient civilizations. But before we rest, there's one more place to visit. Not a specific site, but a concept. The gaps in history. The centuries we've lost because nobody wrote things down, or because what they wrote didn't survive, or because we haven't yet learned to read their writing. Think about everything we've discussed tonight. The Egyptian tombs, the Minoan palaces, the Maya cities, the Indus Valley civilization, the Amber Room, the Aral Sea. Each represents knowledge gained, sometimes knowledge lost and then recovered. But there's so much we'll never know. For every civilization we've excavated and studied, how many more lie undiscovered? How many cities are buried under modern development, their ruins destroyed by construction before archaeologists even knew they were there? How many were built from wood and mud brick that left almost no trace? Literacy is rare in human history. Writing was invented independently only a few times, in Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, Mesoamerica. It spread from those origins, but until very recently, most humans couldn't read or write. The vast majority of human experience went unrecorded. Even when things were written down, survival was unlikely. We've talked about the Library of Alexandria and its lost texts, but that's just one example. Libraries burned throughout history. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, destroyed by Mongol invasion in 1258. The Mayan codices, burned by Spanish priests who thought they were works of the devil. Only 4 survive today. Countless smaller libraries, private collections, archives, lost to fire, flood, war, neglect. And before writing, oral traditions can preserve remarkable amounts of information across generations. Australian Aboriginal cultures maintain oral histories stretching back tens of thousands of years, embedding practical survival knowledge, astronomical observations, and historical events in stories and songs. But oral tradition is fragile. When a language dies, especially if it dies suddenly from disease or genocide, the knowledge encoded in that tradition dies with it. We live in a thin slice of time illuminated by surviving evidence. Most of the past is dark, unknown, unknowable. We make our best guesses from the fragments that remain, but we're always aware of how much is missing. Sometimes the gaps are frustrating, but not critical. We don't know exactly how the Egyptian pyramids were built, but we know they were built, and generally how. Other times the gaps hide crucial information. We don't know what triggered the Bronze Age collapse. We don't know why the Indus civilization declined. We don't know who first built the underground cities of Cappadocia. And sometimes, this is the hardest part, we don't even know what we don't know. What civilizations have vanished so completely that we haven't even discovered they existed? What technologies were developed and then lost? What scientific insights were achieved and then forgotten? There are hints of lost knowledge everywhere. The Antikythera mechanism, an ancient Greek device from around 100 BCE, could calculate astronomical positions and eclipses. Nothing of comparable mechanical complexity appears again until medieval clockwork over 1,000 years later. Roman concrete could set underwater and lasted millennia. The recipe was lost and only recently rediscovered. Damascus steel, famous for its strength and sharpness, was made by techniques now lost. Greek fire, the Byzantine Empire's secret weapon, was a chemical mixture that burned on water. Its composition is unknown. Each of these represents knowledge that existed, that people once understood, that was then lost. How much else has been lost that we don't even know to look for? The silent centuries speak through artifacts rather than texts. A beautifully crafted pot tells us someone had artistic skill and technical knowledge, but it doesn't tell us their name, their thoughts, their hopes, their daily life. We can analyze the pot scientifically, determine its age and composition and use, but we can't hear the voice of the person who made it. This is why archaeology is both fascinating and melancholy. Every discovery illuminates something previously dark, but each discovery also reminds us how much remains in darkness. Every answered question reveals more unanswered ones. The ancient civilizations we've explored tonight, Egypt, Crete, Greece, Maya, Indus, China, Easter Island, the ancestral Puebloans, they're the lucky ones. They left enough evidence that we remember they existed. We can visit their ruins, study their artifacts, decipher their scripts. We can reconstruct, however imperfectly, something of their worlds. But they're not representative. They're unusual precisely because they're visible. Most human societies, through history built from perishable materials, didn't develop writing, didn't create monuments intended to last forever. They lived, they died, they left almost nothing for archaeologists to find. Their stories are lost in the silent centuries. As you drift toward sleep, think about this. Beneath your feet, wherever you are, there are layers of time. People walked where you walk now. They lived their lives, full of the same hopes and fears and joys and sorrows that fill your life. They built homes and raised children and told stories and created things they thought were important, and almost all of it is gone, returned to soil, forgotten. We are all temporary. Our civilizations are temporary. Even our species is temporary in the grand scope of time. But while we're here, we create, we build, we make art and architecture, we record our thoughts, we leave traces, hoping that some future person might find them and remember that we existed. The ancient world is not truly dead. It lives in the ruins we excavate, in the texts we decipher, in the artifacts we preserve, in the stories we tell about it. Every time we remember Tutankhamun, or admire the terracotta warriors, or puzzle over Easter Island's Moai, we're keeping those civilizations alive. Not as they actually were. We can never fully recover that. But as memories, as lessons, as inspiration. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps being remembered, even imperfectly, even by people thousands of years in the future who get many details wrong, is a kind of immortality. The pharaohs wanted to live forever. In a way, they succeeded. Just not how they imagined. The sand remembers everything we said at the beginning, and it's true. The sand preserves what we bury, protecting it until someone comes to dig it up. But the sand also erases, covering over, wearing away, returning everything eventually to dust. We stand between preservation and erasure, between remembering and forgetting. We dig up the past, we study it, we try to understand it. And in doing so, we're creating our own layer that future archaeologists might someday excavate. What will they find? What will they think of us? What will they remember? And what will be lost in their own silent centuries? These are questions without answers, mysteries we'll never solve, but they're worth pondering as you drift off to sleep, as your consciousness fades and dreams take over. In dreams, time becomes fluid. Past and present mix. You might walk through ancient cities, speak with long-dead peoples, see civilizations at their height before the collapse. And when you wake, you'll be back in the present. But maybe you'll carry with you some sense of the deep time stretching behind us, the countless lives lived and forgotten, the civilizations that rose and fell, and the thin thread of memory that connects us to all of it. Sleep well. The ancient world is at rest, and so can you be. The ruins will still be there tomorrow, waiting patiently as they've waited for centuries, holding their secrets, telling their stories to anyone willing to listen. The sand remembers everything. And now, so do you.